Following the EDSA People Power Revolution, the Institute for Labor and Manpower Studies was abolished by virtue of Executive Order Number 126 by then President Corazon C. Aquino on January 31, 1987. Its research and publications functions were absorbed by the newly created Center for Labor Studies. On July 25, 1987, Executive Order 251 was released, amending EO 126, which elevated the status of the Center for Labor Studies into what is now known as the Institute for Labor Studies. The new status gave the Institute flexibility in responding to the department's need for comprehensive and innovative researches in support of policy decision-making. Barely 2 years after the 1987 dole-wide reorganization, ILS has made its mark as the department's think tank. The Institute undertook a study on the effectiveness of the department's policies and programs through an evaluation of the regional tripartite consultations, which the DOLE established in 1987 in support of the national policy of consultation-based decision-making. Inspired by its vision of becoming the leading institution in labor and employment research and advocacy, ILS continues its commitment to promote good governance through the delivery of innovative, responsible, competent, and cutting-edge research and technical services along the full breadth of policy development process in the Department of Labor and Employment. It is our mission to deliver innovative, relevant, and responsive knowledge products and services on labor and employment through meaningful collaboration and cooperation towards promoting evidence-based policymaking. The Institute for Labor Studies is guided by its core values: integrity, excellence, public service, innovation, compassion. Behind each and every research is a group of keen, talented, and inquisitive civil servants with fresh insights in advocating for the creation of labor policies. These key ILS professionals continue to ensure that the ILS legacy of promoting evidence-based decision-making is evident in each and every study for recommendation and in all research collaborations conducted with all our stakeholders. The ILS has produced more than 500 researches and provided policy recommendations for more than 1,000 legislative bills, which were instrumental in providing guidance in crafting more than 300 laws, administrative, and department orders. The Institute for Labor Studies continues its legacy of being the premier research institute responsive to the needs of the Filipino workforce by providing policy recommendations through research and evidence-based decision-making. We shall realize this by continuously providing opportunities for our people who are at the heart of our work.
Para sa akin, ang gender balance is having equal opportunities for everyone.
At yung pantay-pantay na karapatan ng bawat isa at tamang pagtrato sa lahat ng empleyado ng isang organisasyon, ito man ay babae man o lalaki.
In the workplace, I think there should be a healthy mix of all the genders, syempre. Access to opportunities like benefits at lahat yun ay accessible to all of the genders represented.
Para po sa akin, gender balance po sa workplace bilang isang estudyante at magtatapos, yung pumabigyan po ang mga new graduates na estudyante ng mga pantay at decent opportunities po sa kanilang mapipiling trabaho. Ano man ang kasarian, babae, lalaki, o LGBT.
Well, for me, gender balance in the workplace is achieved when people has equal access, at the same time enjoy the same rewards, resources, and opportunity, regardless of gender.
So for me, gender balance is when your gender or your gender preference is not used to your advantage or disadvantage in any decision in the office.
Sa akin gusto ko sagutin yung tanong ng gender balance sa konteksto ng pagtataya. No? Yung gender balance ay walang labis, walang kulang. Na kung tayo ay nagkilo ng 1 kilo ng bigas ng pagtataya, sa simula pa lang for gender equality hanggang dulo, pag kinilo ang babae, ang lalaki, ang LGBT, 1 kilo pa rin ang bigas.
Kung kaya kong maging security guard, kaya din na isang babae.
Gender balance in the workplace is equal opportunity for personal and career growth.
Naniniwala ko na kayang gawin ng lalaki, kaya din gawin ng babae. Kaya dapat pantay ang karapatan at oportunidad ng lahat.
For me, gender balance is not just giving equal opportunity to everyone, but it's also having the same choices and creating a platform where they can be a better version of themselves. So everyone in the gender is well represented.
Gender equality, gender balance, women empowerment. Ito ay dapat teamwork at hindi lang ang trabaho ng mga babae.
Tayo na pagkakataon na sa and opportunities sa employment, promotion, and benefits.
Gender balance in workplace is having equal work opportunities, regardless of sex.
Gender balance based on two things. On the first level, by challenging what we know in terms of gender norms and stereotypes. On another level, which relates to work, kailangan natin pasagin yung tinatawag na pink glass ceiling. Kaya alam naman natin, yung tinatawag natin pink glass ceiling ay kumbaga yung mga kababaihan ay nagkakaroon ng wages that are lower than their male counterparts. So we have to challenge that. Kailangan pantay. Equal work for equal pay.
Gender balance for me in the workplace is ensuring ease of access to opportunities and resources within the workplace.
To achieve gender balance in the workplace requires a change in the mindset, both men and women, and it begins at home.
For us, gender balance in the workplace is achieved with organizations.
Issue proactive policies.
Ensure inclusive participation and representation at all levels.
Promote equal sharing of responsibilities.
Break stereotypes.
And gender-based violence.
Noon pa man, malaki na ang naging bahagi ng mga kababaihan sa lipunang Pilipino. Kaisa sila sa marubdob na paghahangad ng kalayaan ng ating lahi. Kabilang sila sa paglinang ng ating makulay na sining at mayamang kultura. Kasapi sila sa pagtataguyod ng mga adhikain ng kapwa mamamayan at sa pagtugon sa mga pangangailangan ng lipunan. Katuwang sila sa pagtuklas sa mga larangan ng agham at medisina. Kapanalig sila sa pagpapairal ng batas, karapatan at katarungan para sa lahat. Kabahagi sila sa paglilingkod sa bayan at sa pagpapanatili ng demokrasyang Pilipino. Sa paglipas ng panahon, hindi nagmaliw ang kanilang pag-ibig sa ating inang bayan. Mga kababayan, ito ang alay ng mga kababaihang Pilipino para sa bayan.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I am Francesca Rose Castillo from the Labor and Social Relations Research Division.
And I am Rosie Santa Tomas from the Labor and Social Relations Research Division. And we will be your moderators for this morning's webinar entitled Violence and Harassment. How does it affect productivity? We are your hosts for today's webinar. But before we start, I would like to acknowledge our participants on Zoom and on Facebook Live and our OIC ED and Miss Lumakdod as well as Miss Valentina. Good afternoon and good morning as well.
Thank you, Rosie. So good afternoon again, everyone, and good morning to Valentina, who is currently in Geneva right now. Before we start, may we request everyone to pause for a while for our prayer to be led by Miss Karil Chani Las.
Oh, hello. Good afternoon to all. So let us put ourselves in the holy presence of the Lord as we pray in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Dear God, we praise you for this online event and your purpose for it. Take what we have prepared and multiply our efforts as only you can. Steer our intentions to align with your righteous will. Remind us of your faithful provision when our efforts fail or fall short. May all glory go up to you when we accomplish our objectives and climb over benchmarks. We lift the people in our governments, civil society, businesses, informal sector, labor unions, non-government organizations, academic institutions, and all those resting with all we must do to transform our societies and economies. Grant them boldness of vision, audacity of spirit, and commitment to strengthen industrial relations and promote organizing in the informal economy while helping the most vulnerable members of the society. Open our eyes to see, our hearts to hear, and our voices to sing the many praises of you and of those who are on the margins of our world. Blanket us with your peace today, Father. Keep us physically safe and guard our hearts and minds from pride and selfishness. Keep love at the forefront of our minds today and the guiding light for all we set out to accomplish and celebrate. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Ms. CJ. Before we officially start the webinar, we'd like to have a few reminders to our participants in Zoom. This meeting is being recorded and streamed via ILS Facebook page. And to better facilitate our discussion, we have with us today Mr. Dieter Navarroza of ILS to remind us of some of the house rules to consider.
Good afternoon, everyone. So here are the webinar guidelines for this afternoon's webinar. 1. Please be sure to use your agency's name and full name when you enter the Zoom hall. Bring with you your interest, open mind, courtesy, active participation, and drinking water throughout the webinar. Kindly turn off or mute your microphone during the webinar unless when raising questions during the open forum. You may or may not turn on your video, but everyone is enjoined to have their video on during the photo opportunity after the session. If you suddenly got cut off due to connectivity, just click the Zoom link to be back in the webinar hall. Questions will be entertained during the open forum, but anytime you want to raise questions, you can use chat box and indicate if you are directing the question to a specific speaker. During the open forum, you can raise a hand virtually to be recognized. Also, materials and certificate will be provided after the session. As always, let us keep this webinar a safe learning space and environment for an optimal experience. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you again, sir. So, This webinar is part of the 2023 ILS Policy Advocacy Series, wherein we aim to raise public awareness and provide venue for collaboration with different sectors and stakeholders in advocating and advancing workers' rights and better future for decent work. So particularly this month, although we have concluded the 18-day campaign to end violence against women, all the topics that will be discussed in this webinar will be related to our advocacy to fully eliminate all forms of violence and harassment against women and even the gender-based violence and harassment.
That's right, Miss Jessica. That is why, as part of the 18-day campaign to end violence against women, I believe topics to be presented by our speakers later are truly necessary. And to officially start our webinar, may we call on our OIC Executive Director, Attorney Mary Grace Biguertia of the Institute of Labor Studies to give us the opening remark.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you, Jessica. To our guest speaker for today, Miss Valentina Begini of the International Labor Organization at Geneva. To my colleagues at the Institute for Labor Studies, as well as also my colleagues at the Department of Labor and Employment. There might be heads of attached agencies, bureaus, and services joining us today. And also our partners from other government agencies and also our development partners, especially from those from the tripartite sectors. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you once again for joining our webinar today. Women around the world are disproportionately affected by gender-based violence. And according to literature, the most common form of gender-based violence in the world of work is sexual harassment. And sexual harassment is defined as an unwelcome and offensive conduct of a sexual nature that may cause humiliation, intimidation, and discomfort among workers. And this is clearly a violation of workers' rights. Sexual harassment is overwhelmingly a problem women workers face, which produces feelings of revulsion, violation, and powerlessness. Millions of female workers have been forced to experience unwelcome forms of sexual conduct and work in intimidating and hostile environment, as they are always or often exposed to inappropriate jokes, comments, and unwanted physical contact that can amount to assault. Within the workplace, workers may experience gender-based violence or harassment from a coworker, supervisor, or employer, which could compromise workplace safety and reduce productivity and engagement among staff. In June 2019, the International Labor Conference adopted Convention number 190. It is the first international treaty to recognize the right of everyone to a world of work free from violence and harassment, including gender-based violence and harassment. This convention later came into force on June 25, 2021, so just recently. The convention covers both the formal and informal economy and applies to workplace, work-related activities, and work-related communication. Convention 190 also defines violence and harassment as a range of unacceptable behaviors and practices or threats thereof, whether a single occurrence or repeated occurrences that aim at, result in, or are likely to result in physical, psychological, sexual, or economic harm, and includes gender-based violence and harassment. Last October this year, President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. ratified the convention, and we are happy to know that earlier this week, the Philippine Senate has concurred its ratification through a resolution. And this marks another milestone for the Philippines as we continue to embark on this journey to eliminate all forms of violence and harassment in the world of work. And such ratification also strengthens our mandate to promote and protect the rights of Filipino workers, especially women workers. Today's webinar will dive further into the details of ILO Convention number 190 and how this ratification will amplify the policies and future actions of the government, particularly our department, the Department of Labor and Employment, in achieving the goal of eliminating violence and harassment in the world of work. So today we are very fortunate to have with us a distinguished speakers, one of which I have mentioned and we welcomed earlier, Ms. Valentina Begini of the International Labor Organization Geneva headquarters, and also our very own researcher, Ms. Joyce Ann Lumactud, who will share findings of her thesis for her master's degree regarding labor force participation cost of sexual violence and harassment in the Philippines. So again, I welcome you all to this webinar, and I hope you will gain insights and also be directed and guided as to your advocacies and your projects regarding in relation to the elimination of violence and harassment in the world of work. Please do participate in the discussions, that an open forum that will be made available to all, and I thank especially the ILS family for organizing this event, and thank you all, and again, good afternoon.
Thank you, Attorney Grace, for welcoming our presenters and participants today and for your opening message on the challenges brought by gender-based violence, specifically sexual harassment in the workplace. Gender-based violence in the form of sexual harassment had indeed affected many women and men in the workplace. Indeed, an inclusive and zero-tolerance approach is needed to enable those who suffered and still suffering from violence and harassment to report incidents of such with the knowledge and assurance that perpetrators will be met with appropriate sanctions. That is why the recent and historical ILO C-190 ratification of the Senate is a significant step towards ensuring safe workplace for all workers, regardless of employment status and whether they came from private or public sectors or from formal or informal economy. So to formally start the webinar, I would like to introduce our first speaker this afternoon. Our first speaker is the Supervising Labor and Employment Officer of the Labor and Social Relations Research Division of the ILS. She recently finished her master's degree in economics at Kobe University. Her research interests are non-standard forms of work arrangement, collective bargaining, and gender and development. Her master's thesis titled The Labor Force Participation Cost of Sexual Violence and Harassment in the Philippines, an analysis of the impact of sexual violence and harassment in women's decisions to work. This is based on the recommendation of the earlier study of the Institute for Labor Studies to consider the risk associated with violence and harassment. This paper comprehensively discussed the cost of sexual violence and harassment, which has far-reaching effects ranging from individual victim to the workplace, the government, and the economy. Let us all welcome Ms. Joyce Ann Lumactud.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to Valentina. I would be presenting the results of the study entitled The Labor Force Participation Cost of Sexual Violence and Harassment in the Philippines, an analysis of the impact of sexual violence and harassment in women's decision to work. So allow me to share my screen. So the outline of my presentation is as follows. It is divided into 6 parts. First, I will discuss the background. I'll give some information on the issue and what the study seeks to address. I will delve into literature review of the impact of sexual violence and harassment based on existing studies. Then I would be discussing the framework of analysis, basically the theoretical and conceptual frameworks. I will delve a little bit on the methodology, the data sources, and the models used for the analysis. I will discuss the findings and finally conclude with some recommendations. So my research question would be, how do police-reported sexual violence and harassment affect women's decision to work outside the home? But before I seek to answer this question, there is a need to define violence and harassment. According to International Labor Organization Convention number 190, it is a range of unacceptable behaviors, practices, or threats thereof, whether a single occurrence or repeated, that aims at, results in, or are likely to result in physical, psychological, sexual, or economic harm. The purpose of this study is limited to the sexual violence and harassment. Before I move on, I would be discussing key assumptions that is used in the paper. First is that violence is an extreme form of discrimination based on gender inequality. Second is that sexual violence and harassment brings economic harm. Third is sexual violence and harassment can be one factor contributing to the female labor force participation. We can stipulate that violence is an extreme form of discrimination based on gender inequality, where gender inequality can be defined as the differentiation between women and men by legal, political, economic, social, and cultural structures. Some examples are unequal access to employment and healthcare, and culturally assigned roles that are so rigidly defined that they limit women's involvement in the family, in the workplace, and in society. For the second assumption, there are several studies that have been conducted that enumerate how sexual violence and harassment brings economic harm. For example, Deloitte Economics in 2019 stipulated that the government costs come from the loss in tax revenue and the cost of program implementation through investigation and litigation. Shaw et al. And Folk also enumerated the firm-level consequences of sexual violence and harassment. And these are productivity loss, job turnover, and costs related to medical claims and litigation. And Shaw and Deloitte Economics also tackled individual consequences, which are physical, sexual, and emotional shocks, which can lead to employment consequences. Historically, the female labor force participation rate, or the percentage of the total number of women in the labor force to the total female population 15 years old and over of the Philippines, has been about 40 to 50% since 2010, according to the National Economic Development Authority report in 2019. In general, labor force participation is influenced by fertility, education, and favorable economic conditions. In poorer countries, a substantial share of women go to work out of economic necessity. And in countries with barriers to women's freedom or choices, the family circumstances and social norms contribute to the decline in the female labor supply. And finally, in a study by Heath and Jayandran in 2017, they attribute the increase of female labor force participation in developing countries to the increased female education, the policies that strengthen the Education for All initiative, and the rise in the services industries that gives opportunities to women, thereby contributing to an enabling environment for female labor force participation. So based on these conditions, there are really diverse drivers of female labor force participation. And it is quite difficult to ascertain from the existing literature an exhaustive list of what could be considered as the standard list of drivers and standard list of barriers that could be considered as part of female labor force participation. So aside from economic conditions, it is important to also explore other aspects that drive female labor supply, such as demographic conditions. And one such aspect is sexual violence and harassment. So based on these assumptions, we go back to the research question: how do police-reported sexual violence and harassment affect women's decision to work outside the home? One part of answering this research question is conducting literature reviews, which I divided into three broad categories: the economic impact of sexual violence and harassment, country-specific studies on the effects of sexual violence and harassment to labor market outcomes, and some statistics of sexual violence and harassment in the Philippines. A country's wealth includes various types of capital, such as natural capital, produced capital, which comes from investment in assets, and human capital. The human capital, according to a World Bank report by Woodon, Kentin, and De La Beer in 2018, is the largest component of a country's wealth. The losses in earnings that result from gender inequality around the world affect global wealth estimated at $160.2 trillion, which is 14% of the estimate for global wealth. So this study just shows how if there is gender inequality, there is a corresponding figure that is affected, the future earnings that is affected. Furthermore, the cost of workplace sexual harassment is largely shouldered by the employer as loss of productivity, the government costs that came from losses in tax revenue, while individual costs resulted from losses in income. And in others literature also computed the monetary value for the societal harm caused by sexual harassment to workers. For example, in the United States, the amount is $7.6 million. This value captures both the effect of the harassment claim itself, as well as the average influence of all harassment incidents in a particular industry and age group that are correlated with this claim. For the second part, we look at country-specific studies on the effects of sexual violence and harassment to labor market outcomes. In the first two studies, the country in that is subject to the research is India, and they both are similar in the results. For example, Siddique and Chakraborty et al. Analyzes the effect of sexual harassment, sexual crimes, and the results of the studies verified that there is a negative relationship between sexual assaults and female labor supply, especially on the labor force participation outside their homes. And this is also corroborated by Mishra et al., which says that sexual crime had a significant and asymmetric effect on men and women in the labor force, especially on the labor force participation outside their homes. An increase in total crime reduced women's participation and increases males' labor force participation. Then we also look at other developing countries. Wozniak, Bielorussia et al. Studied Mexico, Sri Lanka, China, and Cambodia, and the observed effects were summarized as follows. Those who experienced harassment exhibited withdrawal from work, changes in work attitudes, and work quality. However, while the results show the impact of workplace harassment on the intent to quit their job, this did not translate to the actual decision to quit. And in Ghana, the prevalence of sexual violence of harassment of women and girls resulted in a 1.10% loss of its GDP, with a projected macroeconomic loss of 0.94% of GDP in 2024 if sexual violence and harassment is left unchecked. And finally, in the United States, sexual violence was associated with a 6.6% decline in female labor force participation and a 5.1% decline in their wages. Furthermore, the effects were stronger when the perpetrators that are in question are strangers. For the local setting, the Philippines is one of the countries that promotes gender equality and the protection of workers from sexual harassment. This slide shows the laws and policies that combat violence and harassment in the Philippines. In an earlier study by the Institute, this was briefly discussed according to their functions for the protection and prevention, enforcement, and advocacy. But based on the reported cases to the Philippine National Police, the data shows that the majority of the complaints are non-physical, such as but not limited to voyeurism, online harassment, and sextortion. Meanwhile, the physical sexual violence and harassment cases include child prostitution, rape, and sexual assault. If we delve further into the parties involved, the reports reveal that the majority of the named perpetrators in these cases have no relation to the victim. They were either employers or colleagues, not limited to supervisors or managers, or someone with direct control over the victim. It should be noted that these cases are not entirely representative of the prevalence of sexual violence and harassment in the Philippines, because underreporting and dropping of charges, even before reaching the authorities, are common, as the victims often feel fear and sometimes guilt over the experience. The stigma surrounding the victims of sexual violence and harassment often leads to a culture of silence, causing the number of such cases to be underreported, leading to limited sexual violence-related studies. For the next part of my presentation, I would be presenting the theoretical and conceptual frameworks used as guide to provide an analysis of the results. One such theory that I would be discussing on how police reported sexual violence and harassment influences a women's decision to work is the geometrical theory of crime. This theory suggests that crime streams from opportunities given to the perpetrators in their everyday environment. As shown in the figure by Brattingham, and Anderson in 2016, this theory posits that sexual assaults are most likely to take place at activity nodes and along pathways where there is a high convergence and interaction of potential perpetrators and victims. Hence, the fear of being a victim of sexual violence and harassment starts when a woman steps outside her home, such as when commuting to work, in the work environment, when visiting friends, going to school, and even conducting leisure activities. Other theories were also explored in the studies, particularly the theories on female labor force participation. So first is the work leisure theory. This theory suggests that other economic, social, and demographic variables affect labor supply decisions aside from wages. So it incorporated how gender-based violence in the analysis of women's labor force participation. And I used it in this study to support the hypothesis that SVH has a negative effect on a woman's decision to work outside the home. And for the human capital theory, due to the causal link between health and education, the human capital theory is used to analyze the factors that influence labor market outcomes. So violence against women may affect their economic well-being through its effect on their health, and thereby affecting their education and eventually their work. Therefore, sexual violence and harassment lowers women's health capital, which influences their decision to allocate more time to the labor market compared to other activities. In the modernization theory, according to this theory, the development of an economy is positively associated with female labor force participation through a change in the country's occupational structure, such as the increasing availability of services, increased educational opportunities, and the like. So therefore, the process of modernization is associated with an increased demand for female labor and a universal social acceptance of women's education and employment. This conceptual framework provides an overview of the decision-making process of a woman when informed of incidents of sexual violence and harassment. The analysis of this paper revolves around the premise that the threat of being a victim of violence and harassment and the physical and psychological effects that ensues is one of the determinant in a woman's decision to work. The existing literature provided new insights on how female labor force participation is influenced by socioeconomic and cultural conditions. And it is posited that women decide to work if the payoff or the net utility of going to work is less or greater than the cost of the risk of being victimized. Furthermore, the resulting behavior is the response to the pervasive fear of being raped or being sexually assaulted. And accordingly, women opted to adopt the strategy of avoidance by modifying their lifestyle. And in the case of this study, to decide if they want to work outside their homes or not. So this paper uses the concept of the fear of being a victim of sexual violence and harassment as an underlying factor of a woman's decision to work outside the home, either to work at home if qualified or not work at all. This research uses quantitative methods to analyze the link between police-reported sexual violence and harassment and women's decision to work outside the home. The data are mainly culled from the 2018 labor force survey and the crime database of the Philippine National Police. The 2018 LFS is the latest data that completed 4 rounds of survey before the pandemic started. And the 2019 LFS was released much later, hence incomplete during the data gathering period of this research. So the latest data that I was able to gather is the 2018 labor force survey, and I was able to do use the panel data of the 4 quarters of the labor force survey. As you can see in the table, the dependent variable is LFP, which stands for labor force participation. This term is different from the Philippine Statistics Authority's definition because I used LFP in this paper to refer to the probability of a woman working outside the home. This variable is the dependent variable. This is what I will use to determine the effect. This is how the decision point of the woman, and it is a dummy variable which takes the value of 1 when a woman is a regular or casual worker for the past week. The main explanatory variable is police reported sexual violence and harassment, or PRSBH. This is the percentage of sexual violence and harassment committed on every 1,000 females by region. And I am using a lag report by 1 quarter, so that is time minus 1 when I conducted the analysis. The age of the females are from 15 to 65 years old, which is considered as the economically active ages. So the education is the highest grade completed. And also I included other control variables, which are the marital status, wage, household size, and the number of children in the household. So this is the model that I use to analyze the effect of sexual violence and harassment in a woman's decision to work. In this paper, the dependent variable, the labor force participation, takes the value of 1 when a woman is working outside their home and 0 otherwise. So this variable aims to be a proxy for the decision of a woman to work outside the home, inasmuch as the decision itself is not measurable. So I use the probit model to capture the binary outcome, the 0 and 1, of the probability of a woman working outside the home. So I use probit regression, and the model is described as follows. Labor force participation, IHBT, equals alpha plus beta PRSBH, T minus 1, the lag report, and beta sub 2 XIT plus beta sub 3 XHT, and B sub B and UIT, where LFP is the labor force participation of a woman, I, in a household H in barangay B at a certain time T. PRSVH is the lag police reports, 1/4 lag on sexual violence and harassment against women. X is the individual and household control variables, and B is the barangay level fixed effects. So my sample is consisting of 115,249 females nationwide, aged 15 to 65 years old, and they live in a household that can have an average of 5 people. The maximum number of people in the household is 22, and the least number of people in the household is one person. So one household can have as much as 14 children, and the least number of children is actually 0 in a household. In terms of marital status and educational attainment, so you can see in the chart that 38.07% have only reached the elementary level, and most of them are either elementary, high school, or having some degree of having a bachelor's degree. And if you could see in the second figure, most of the sample women are married, 59%, followed by those who are single. When I looked at the analysis of this paper, I did 3 parts in my analysis: the baseline estimation, heterogeneity analysis, and the placebo test. The baseline estimation used a probit model to estimate the effect of sexual violence and harassment on female labor force participation. In testing the premise that the threat of being a victim of violence and harassment is one determinant in female labor supply. And I conducted the heterogeneity analysis to support this baseline estimation with a number of estimations that is done with different characteristics of the individual, as I will show earlier. And then a placebo test is done in order to ascertain that the estimations are not spurious, and regression is done to describe how sexual violence and harassment affect the male labor force participation. So in this table, I hope everyone can see the numbers clearly. The assumption is that sexual violence and harassment is a deterrent to women's labor force participation, specifically affecting women's decision to work outside the home. So the average marginal effects of the coefficients are used between in interpreting the results. So the first column 1, is estimates just 2 variables: the relationship between police-reported sexual violence and harassment with 1 period lag, and the dependent variable without controlling for any other variables, just police reported and its effect on female labor force participation. The coefficient indicates that police reported sexual violence and harassment negatively affects those who work outside the home. But if you also look at column 2, which added the individual and household controls, it shows that the effect is still negative. And then column 3 also added barangay fixed effects. So barangay fixed effects is added to control for unobserved heterogeneity, to address omitted variable bias, and to handle spatial autocorrelation to improve the precision of the estimates. So basically, adding barangay fixed effects captures the effects of barangay-specific characteristics that are constant over time but may also affect female labor force participation. So the last column includes another lag, so 2-quarter lags in the estimation to describe how long police-reported sexual violence and harassment affects women's decision to work outside the home. So I'm going to explain these results in narrative form. So this result just means that based on the baseline estimation, PRSVH T-1 is negative and significant, which means that SVH is a deterrent for women to work outside the home. So this influence in female labor force participation is short-term if you could see in PRSVH T-2, which is positive and significant. It is only short-term. In the study done by, for example, CDK and Chakraborty, which is also use the same method that this study uses, the result is negative and insignificant. But in this study, in this particular study, the result is positive and significant. So what does this entail? It explains that the effect of having information of sexual crimes in the neighborhood is a deterrent for 1 quarter. But if you add another quarter, so the longer the information is known, the lesser the effect to the female, to the individual. So, but this result is positive and significant, which suggests that it is no longer a threat for them because, number one, the issue of sexual crimes reported for more than 4 months does not influence a woman's decision to work outside the home. So it's possible that she forgot about it, or she feels safer, or there is a change in her circumstances that could make this information not relevant anymore. And second, which is I want to emphasize, there may be actions done in response to the police reported sexual violence and harassment by entities such as local government or non-government organizations or firms to prevent further crime from happening in that particular neighborhood, and thereby creating a safer work environment for women. The other parts of the results show how age, education, marital status, wages, the household size, and the number of children contributes to their decision to work outside the home. So aside from the reports of hearing about sexual violence and harassment in their neighborhood, they also have to consider their individual and household situation. So this estimation just shows that age has a positive and significant effect on female labor force participation. Women are more likely to work outside their homes as they get older. However, the negative coefficient on age squared suggests that its effect on female labor force participation reverses after a certain age. So it is not during their lifespan, sexual violence and harassment information does not really affect their decision to work when they reach a certain age. And education, which has a negative and significant relationship for women, suggests that women who have higher education level may reflect a better job, thereby fetching a higher income, which implies a lesser need for women to work outside the home. World Bank report also lists the characteristics, the functions of jobs that are able or that may be able to work within their homes or within their preferred environment other than their workplace. So this supports the findings that education has a negative and significant relationship with female labor force participation. Wage and female labor force participation have a negative and significant relationship. This result may suggest that a woman may still earn even when she does not go outside her home. Hence, even if there's an increase in wages, the availability of jobs that enables women to stay at home may be a better option for them to not go outside to work. And when we look at the household size, there is a negative and significant relationship, which suggests that women may have more responsibilities when there are more people in the household. Hence, working outside may not be feasible. This does not deter them, however, from being part of the labor force, but rather encourages a job that enables them to stay at home if they are qualified. Marital status has a negative effect of the decision of women to work outside their homes, but it is insignificant, which can suggest that there is a need for them to go outside in spite of the environment of their neighborhood. And the relationship between the number of children in the household and female LFP suggests that taking care of children is not the sole responsibility of a woman, as there are other members of the household, such as siblings, that can take care of the children. Heterogeneity analysis, as I mentioned earlier, I just wanted to show how the information of sexual violence and harassment affect different age groups. For this particular table, it shows that those who are at the age of 15 to 25 years old are least likely to be affected by incidents of sexual crimes or reported sexual crimes in their neighborhood. And this may be attributable to the fact that this age group is at the beginning of being part of the labor force, and hence women need the experience to engage in different types of employment and may thus not be qualified to stay inside their homes and or work inside their homes or not work at all. In terms of marital status, this table shows how it affects incidents of sexual crimes in the neighborhood affects single, married, and widowed women. And if you could see, those that are married and widowed are most likely to be affected by this incidents. So it would suggest that compared to the baseline estimations, which shows insignificant results, the heterogeneity analysis show that married and widowed women are more likely to be affected. And it further suggests that women in these stages of their lives have more at stake when deciding to work outside their home. So for example, the decision to stay at home may be attributable to the suggestion of husbands or children, as it will be dangerous to go outside. Next would be conducting the placebo test. As I mentioned, placebo test is conducted to ensure that since this is a quantitative analysis, the assumption that it only affects female workers would hold true. And if you could look at the table, the result is insignificant, meaning that sexual violence and harassment does not necessarily affect male labor force participation. So based on these results, we have the key takeaways from the research. Number one, information on sexual violence and harassment within a woman's living environment influences her choices, particularly on working outside the home. And an increase in the incident of these cases leads to a negative 0.5% chance of a woman working outside the home. Even after adding control variables such as age, education, marital status, number of children, and the fixed effects, the barangay fixed effects, the results remain the same. They remain negative and they remain significant. These results give us confidence that the estimated effect of sexual violence and harassment is unlikely to be confounded by unobserved factors. Moreover, women aged 15 to 25 years old are less likely to be affected by information on incidents in their neighborhood. However, the married and widowed women are most likely to be affected by incidents of sexual violence and harassment. The results of this study show that our hypothesis of police-reported sexual violence and harassment as a deterrent to the decision of women to work outside their home holds true. And in all the models I presented, there is a negative relationship of these sexual crimes and female labor force participation. As I mentioned, it is subjected to different checks, heterogeneity and robustness check, and the impact of this incident is only short term for the women. In the Philippines, the sphere of sexual violence and harassment and the labor market is already established. What is lacking is empirical evidence of how sexual violence and harassment exactly affects the labor market in the Philippines, since data is mostly from qualitative analysis and anecdotal reports. Hence, this paper can spearhead discussions on how the Philippines can measure the effect of sexual crimes in the labor market by looking at how it affects the decision of women to work or continue working outside their homes. Since this study is limited to the 4 quarters of 2018, there are really some areas that are unexplored. Hence, there are topics that are recommended for future research, such as industry analysis on the impact of sexual violence and harassment to job turnover, the effectiveness of existing mechanisms in combating sexual violence and harassment, and extending this research to include the recent data from the labor force survey. And as part of the initiatives, it may be proposed that the areas for future research and the research findings of this paper be included in a Gender and Development Agenda 2023 to 2030, which would also contribute to the function of the Department of Labor and Employment as one of the members of the Oversight Committee to recommend policies and guidelines or measure to ensure the effective implementation of the Safe Spaces Act according to Section 34 of the Implementing Rules and Regulations of the Safe Spaces Act. So this ends my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I hope that we continue to be vigilant and continue to help provide a healthy and safe environment for women workers to not be affected by incidents of sexual violence and harassment. So end vow now, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Choice, for sharing your comprehensive study on how violence and harassment, particularly though sexual in nature, can greatly affect the productivity and personal development of women. So based on the study presented by Ms. Choice, we have seen how violence and harassment can exacerbate inequality, especially when it affects women's choices to go outside of their home and even their choices to join the labor force. So it shows that violence and harassment is not an issue on employment and standards only, but an issue on occupational safety and health. Actually, she also mentioned that there are various literature that have proven that violence and harassment can affect the safety and health of individuals at work and undermine their rights to equality. Um, so we have here our other speaker from Geneva, but I think she's just preparing, so we can have a quick 5-minute break, a bio break for everyone, and tune in. We'll be right back in 5. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon again, everyone. So let us now proceed with our second presentation. And I have an honor and privilege to introduce our second speaker, Ms. Valentina Vicchini. She is a lawyer by training with a PhD on European and Comparative Legal Studies and over 15 years working experience at the national and international level, including the government agencies, the United Nations, various NGOs, and private sector in Europe, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So she has worked extensively on the fundamental principles and rights at work, international labor standards, gender equality, and children's rights. She is currently working as the legal specialist on violence, harassment, and non-discrimination in the Gender Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion branch of the International Labor Organization in Geneva, coordinating the work on the promotion of the ratification of ILO Violence and Harassment Convention 2019 or Convention number 190, and of its implementation along with its accompanying recommendation number 206. Let us all welcome Ms. Valentina Bikini. Good morning, Valentina.
Good afternoon, Miss Castillo. How are you? Hi, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today and congratulate, first of all, Philippines for the recent conclusion of the domestic process towards the ratification of Convention 190. Bravo to all of you. So without further ado, I will go straight into my presentation. So I will share my screen if it's possible. And as discussed, I will, yes, here it is. Okay. Yes, just 1 second. Okay, space selected. Oh. Okay. I hope you can see the screen. Otherwise, just give me a shout. So first of all, congratulations for the research that was carried out and reported earlier. It is very interesting, and as ILO, we're very happy to have these findings because are really important. So the topic of my presentation today is to give you an overview of the framework of the Violence and Harassment Convention 190 and its accompanying recommendation 206. So you are all familiar with this instrument. It's the latest adopted by the International Labour Conference in 2019, and it's the first framework addressing the prevention and elimination of violence and harassment in the world of work in a comprehensive and integrated manner. We already heard from the previous speakers that violence and harassment is a widespread phenomenon. So it's unfortunately, it's a phenomenon that occurs in all countries, regardless of the level of development, regardless of the geographical coordinates. So it's really, and unfortunately, a worldwide phenomenon. It affects everyone. Although some groups, as the research was also pointing out, are more at risk, and women in particular are among the most represented risk for some forms of violence and harassment. But the risk of violence and harassment can increase also depending on the specific sectors, occupations, or work arrangements that a worker work in. Okay, so it is not related. Research has found that the prevalence of violence and harassment is not only related to the personal characteristics of the victim, but also of the working environment, the sector, occupation, and the working condition. Of course, there are other factors that can increase this risk. So stress, discrimination, and the research already pointed this out, working in contact with the public, working alone, working in remote areas, all these are risks that could further increase the exposure to violence and harassment. Of course, crisis exacerbate vulnerability. And as it was already mentioned, so I won't go into details, not only violence and harassment violate human rights, but also undermine physical and mental health, labor force participation, productivity, sustainable enterprises. In other words, violence and harassment not only has a human cost, but it also has an economic cost for both the victim, their family, the community, the employers, business, and governments, eventually society as a whole. In 2021, the ILO joined forces with Gallup and Lloyd Register Foundation to carry out a first global survey on the prevalence and experiences of violence and harassment. As you know, the data on violence and harassment are quite scattered and scarce, because it's very difficult to measure violence and harassment. And what is also difficult is also to have data that are comparable. Because not only because the different countries have different notions of violence and harassment, there are cultural issues. So it's really difficult to compare data, to have data and to compare data. For this reason, we did a first exploratory exercise in 2021, and we tested the same questionnaire, okay, in 121 countries. So we use the same question, so to be sure that, you know, we could have comparable data. And what this survey found out is that 1 in 5 persons in employment, so 1 in 5, have experienced violence and harassment. What also the survey has found out is that nearly 1 in 10, okay, has experienced physical violence and harassment, 1 in 5 psychological violence and harassment, and 1 in 15 sexual violence and harassment. In these data, we can find some gender differences. So it was confirmed that women were particularly exposed to sexual violence and harassment. And actually, in those data, we can find the largest gender gap among all the different forms of violence and harassment. We also found out that men are more at risk of physical violence and harassment, while for psychological, the numbers are more or less the same, are equal, okay? Of course, this data needs to be analyzed with a little bit of cautious, because for instance, many respondents refuse, for example, to talk about their experience of sexual violence and harassment, highlighting that this is still a taboo, even if they were in a safe space to reply. And so this data need to be somehow taken as an underestimation of the real magnitude of the phenomenon. What also the survey found out is that, unfortunately, okay, violence and harassment does not happen in isolation, okay? Because more than 3 in 5 victims said that violence and harassment, they experienced violence and harassment multiple times, okay? And this is something that question ourselves if, you know, about the effectiveness of our prevention mechanism to put a stop to these forms of violence and harassment, and also the fact on the effects on the victim. Okay, someone who has been a victim is likely to be again. So what are the effects of violence and harassment on the victim? We also found out that there are some groups, as I said before, that were more exposed, and we have youth, migrant, and wage and salaried women and men. Okay. And even among these groups, we found out that, for example, young women were more exposed than young men to sexual violence and harassment. But we also found out, for example, that migrant women were more exposed to violence and harassment than non-migrant women. So this pointing out not only to the existence of discrimination, and how discrimination, and in fact, to have particular personal characteristics is a risk factor towards violence and harassment, but also how this risk increase when you have multiple identities. So in case of multiple discrimination, intersecting discrimination. So there is a direct link between intersecting discrimination and risk of violence and harassment. What we also found out is that persons affected by discrimination in life were more likely to experience violence and harassment at work. And this is really interesting because it shows the continuum of discrimination, violence, and harassment between the private sphere and the public sphere. Okay, so every measures that once aim to tackle violence and harassment in the world of work also needs to take into account the fact that this cannot happen in isolation. We need to change social mindset. We need to have measures, a whole of society approach that tackles also discrimination. So this is, I mean, from a political and policy perspective, it's really important. I know there are, I will give you the link to this report if you're interested, but we also found out that only half of the victim talk about their experience to somebody. Okay, in the previous research, the previous speaker analyzed reports to the police. In our survey, we were more modest and we asked people if they talk about violence and harassment to somebody, namely family members, spouse, whatever, co-workers, trade unions representative, police, labor inspectors, social workers. So we had a list of possible people in individual and institution. And even if we listed, for example, friends, family members, co-workers, so without having a formal reporting mechanism, even without that, I mean, with that, only half of the victims spoke up. Okay. And this is really interesting because it's really show again that there is a stigma about the fact that you are a victim of violence and harassment, and that you feel ashamed of talking about this. And actually, for the reason why they did not speak, first of all, they quoted fear of time, waste of time. So basically, nothing will change. The second is fear for their reputation, both within their community and both at work. Okay. And the third one, it's unclear procedure at work. So these give us some, hints on how policy measures, should move, in which direction we need to work. The cost, the impact that the violence and harassment has already been, explained in details in the previous presentation. I don't know, perhaps all these studies were already mentioned, but violence and harassment has a huge cost for economies, okay? And we already saw that thanks to the previous excellent speaker. For all this reason, the ILO and its constituents start talking about what can be done, okay? And following a longer process of 5 years of negotiation, although it took even longer because negotiation started the first attempt was back in 2009. So, it's basically almost 10 years. In 2019, we had the adoption of Convention 190. Someone would say that the ILO has always worked on violence and harassment. So this convention is not the first one dealing with violence and harassment, okay? If you are familiar a little bit with international labor standards, think about the Forced Labor Convention. Isn't forced labor a form of violence and harassment? It is. Child labor. Aren't the worst forms of child labor violence and harassment? They are. If you look at Convention 189 on domestic workers, Convention 169 on indigenous and tribal people, you will see that there are specific references to abuse, sexual harassment, sexual exploitation. If you look at all the Migration Convention, if you look at the Equality and Non-Discrimination Convention, we have the Committee of Experts has developed the notion of sexual harassment and discrimination-based harassment. So this is just to say that the issue of violence and harassment is not something new, okay, within the ILO. And we can find different standards, a different convention that tackle some forms of violence and harassment or that protect some groups, okay, like indigenous and tribal people, domestic workers, migrants workers, women, people from ethnic minorities, etc. Okay. What is important of this convention is that it's the first framework, the first treaty that provide an overall framework to prevent and address violence and harassment. And the fact that it was adopted in the year of the centenary of the ILO has also had a symbolic effect to see, okay, the ILO is entering and its constituents are entering the second centenary of their life. And they wanted to make sure that the world of work is based on dignity and respect for everyone. So what are the core elements and the core principle of this convention? The first one that was already mentioned also in the initial remarks is that this convention recognized for the first time the right of everyone to a world of work free from violence and harassment, including gender-based violence and harassment. Let's unpack in the limit of time this right, okay, which become part of the working condition, okay. So this right is not something new, okay. In the past, it was implied by the right to have safe and healthy workplaces, okay. So occupational safety and health. Okay, because if you need to be protected, if your health, both physical and mental, need to be protected from all risks that could cause harm, it is obvious that violence and harassment is included. What about physical violence, psychological, sexual? All have an impact on your physical and mental health. And for this reason, before the convention was adopted, this right was somehow implicit within the protection of safety and health at work. But there was another branch of law that protected and that ensured this right, and was the right to equality and non-discrimination. Because as it was rightly said, sexual harassment, but think also about racial harassment, harassment against people with disabilities, harassment against migrants, all of this are serious manifestation of discrimination. Okay, so in the right to be not discriminated against, you also have the right not to be discriminated, not to be victim of discrimination-based violence and harassment. So what this convention said, okay, it recognized explicitly that there is a right, okay, so all legal system could now, be pushed to also recognize in explicit term this right. And it creates a bridge between the world of occupational safety and health and the world of discrimination. And we will see it in a few minutes. So what is violence and harassment? So I have the right to be free from violence and harassment. What is violence and harassment? It was already mentioned. And I will not go into further detail, but the convention provides a very broad definition. It's a composite definition, and as a range of unacceptable behavior or practice that can cause or aim at producing harm for the victim. Okay, so it's a victim-centered approach. Okay, the constitutive elements are the notion of unacceptability. Okay, so something is unacceptable, and during the standard setting, what was clear is that the notion of unacceptability needs to be understood as both on a societal way, but also on a personal way. Okay, so what the victim think is important and needs to be taken into account. the factual element, so this could be behavior, practices, threats, okay, whatever. It doesn't matter if it's a single occurrence or repeated. And the third element is the harm. So it needs to cause harm. The convention does not list any forms of violence and harassment, and you can easily imagine why. Because it's very difficult to find an agreement between 187 countries. These are the members of the ILO, about what constitutes a list of violence and harassment behavior. In some legal system, some behaviors are labeled as violence, in others are labeled as harassment. In some behaviors, in some countries, some behaviors constitutes harassment. In other countries, some behavior do not represent harassment. Okay, for this reason, the conference decided, okay, let's have a very broad definition. We just highlight the main element, and then we leave national laws and policies to provide, to keep this single concept or to have separate concepts. So to have in the law and in the regulation, the identification of each specific behaviors. You notice that there is no reference to the intent. The intent of the perpetrator does not matter. Okay, so we don't need intent to cause harm to the victim. We also, if you look at the definition, there is no reference to the perpetrator. What does it mean? That this convention protects from violence and harassment regardless of the source. It can be the supervisor, it can be the co-worker, it can be a third party. So horizontal, vertical, and third parties violence are all prohibited by this convention. And of course, there is the definition of gender-based violence and harassment, that is violence and harassment directed at a person because of their sex or gender. So here we have both the biological characteristic, but also the social constructs, the stereotypes that were mentioned also before. So all this represent gender-based violence and harassment. The convention does not define sexual harassment. However, we have a definition of sexual harassment under Convention 111 on discrimination in employment and occupation that has been ratified by the Philippines. And the notion of sexual harassment, very briefly, not only entails the hostile working environment that was mentioned before, but also the quid pro quo, so the this for that, to have, sexual favor in exchange of job benefits. Okay, so all these two elements constitute sexual harassment and needs to be prohibited and prevented, prohibited in law and prevented in practice. There are other forms of discrimination-based harassment that the Committee of Experts or other conventions talk about. So we have racial harassment, for instance, sex-based, gender-based, and harassment based on all other grounds. In the interest of time, I will go quickly. I can come back if you have any question later. Then we saw the right of everyone to a world of work free from violence and harassment. Why right of everyone? Okay, this is very important because the convention has a general scope of application. So it does not apply or cover only employees as defined by national law, but everyone who works irrespective of their contractual status. And this person could work in the informal or informal economy, private or public sector, urban or rural area. They're all protected. Okay, it's really a broad scope of application that remind the ones of the fundamental principle and rights at work. So this is really a general scope of application. The convention listed some groups that are protected. So we have persons also in training, including interns, apprenticeship. It covers also volunteers. It covers job seekers, job applicants. It also covers employers as a physical person. And this go back to the notion of violence and harassment and the fact that there is no reference to the perpetrator. Because when we think about vertical violence and harassment, it's not only the violence from the supervisor to the subordinates, but we have cases, and for those of you who have managerial responsibility, also from subordinates towards supervisors. So what the convention wanted to say is that we need to create a respectful, a peaceful world of work where nobody, okay, and where no forms of violence and harassment are perpetrated. So that's the reason why also employers has physical person, okay, are included. And the convention also takes into account third parties as both perpetrator or victims. And this is very clear. Think about, for example, sectors like health, education, but even banking, the public sector. So everyone who works in contact with the public is at risk, okay? But is at risk not only to be victim of violence and harassment by third party, but also to be a perpetrator towards a third party. And the issue to have a respectful world of work also from third party entering the world of work was a clear intention of the conference, okay? The fact that you enter a post office and you're not, you know, and the worker does not shout at you and they are respectful when you ask for a services without thinking all the, you know, scandals that there are in educational settings or health settings. So really it's a right of everyone to be free from violence and harassment, but it's also a duty, okay, to prevent and to refrain from any forms of violence and harassment. This is very interesting because in this convention, the right holder, so who has the right, is also a duty bearer. Okay, so all of us have the rights to be free from violence and harassment, but all of us has an obligation to refrain from violence and harassment against everyone. And right of everyone to a world of work. What is the world of work? This convention is very innovative because it takes into account the evolving nature of the world of work. It doesn't talk about workplace, okay? Workplace could lead to, you know, the physical workplace. No, it's mentioned the world of work. So it is basically, it's every place you are because of your work. This could be, of course, a workplace, could be any public or private space where the worker is paid, takes a rest, a meal, sanitary, washing and changing facility, work-related trips, travel, training, event, even online. So for those of you who, you know, this training is part of your work, this is also a place where you are protected from violence and harassment. So you are protected from any forms of online, you know, cyberbullying, cyber violence, violent attack, and commuting to and from work. Okay, so this is the broad notion of the world of work. Another element, innovative element of this convention is that it's based on a rights-based framework. What does it mean? This convention recognizes that if we want to eliminate violence and harassment, including gender-based violence and harassment, we need to continue promoting all the fundamental principles and rights at work and ensuring decent work. Why? I think it's obvious, and I said it before. We have nowadays 5 categories of fundamental principles and rights at work. Forced labor and child labor, by definition, they represent violence. Equality and non-discrimination, actually right to non-discrimination. We have seen that some forms of discrimination represent violence and harassment, sexual harassment, for instance. But we also have seen through the survey that there is a continuum between discrimination and violence and harassment. So discrimination not only is a manifestation of violence and harassment, but it's also a root cause. Stereotypes, the fact that we think that women should stay at home and not work and men should be the breadwinner. Stereotypes towards the capacity of migrant workers, stereotypes towards people with disabilities, stereotypes towards members from particular ethnic groups. All these stereotypes, harmful social norms, could lead to hatred, to an environment of social injustice and violence and harassment. Okay, so the linkages are clear. But we also have OSH as a fundamental. And the point is this convention said violence and harassment is also an occupational risk. Okay, because as I said it before, any fact that has an impact on your physical and mental health falls under OSH, is an occupational hazard, occupational risk, and need to be taken into account. And freedom of association and right to collective bargaining. And why? This is an enabling right. And there is research that show that unionized workplaces have a lesser rate of violence and harassment compared to non-unionized workplaces. Okay. It also refers to the fact that many trade union representatives, okay, face violence and harassment. Okay, so you see the interlinkages, and this convention recognize, wait, violence and harassment is not something in isolation that can be tackled in silos. We need to create an enabling environment. And how we do that? Promoting, respecting, and realizing all fundamental principles and rights at work, and ensure decent work. Because that decent work deficits, so poor working condition, are among the risk factors for violence and harassment. And there are a lot of research that show that workers in the informal economy, poor working condition are a risk for violence and harassment. The convention has a particular focus on the right to equality and non-discrimination towards particular group. So women workers, but also other groups that according to national circumstances are more at risk. And yes, and bridges occupational safety and health and discrimination. And we will see later how. So within this overall framework, rights-based framework, what does the convention, what does the convention calls for? The convention calls for the approach of an inclusive, integrated, and gender-responsive approach to prevent and eliminate violence and harassment. This slide, it's also to highlight that promoting equality reduces violence and harassment. There is some research, and there starts some research that, for example, said that the increase in one female director is associated with a 21% decrease in workplace sexual harassment. Also, some ILO research show that when diversity and inclusion actions are embedded in enterprise strategy, respondents are more likely to experience a high level of personal well-being. And of course, within the personal well-being is also the lack of violence and harassment. These are just some data to further highlight the linkages between discrimination and violence and harassment, and this continuum, and how, if we want to tackle violence and harassment, we need to continue promoting equality. So go back to the inclusive, integrated, and gender-responsive approach very briefly. So this is one of the obligations stemming from the convention. Okay, so all member states that ratify need to adopt, in consultation with workers and employers representative, an inclusive, integrated, and gender-responsive approach for the prevention and elimination of violence and harassment. After all the elements that I gave you, I think you can also guess what inclusive, integrated, and gender responsive refers to. Inclusive, because it applies to everyone, okay? But also inclusive because it's based on social dialogue, and it's based on dialogue with people more affected, because we need to understand what are the specific risks that lead to violence and harassment in a specific sectors, occupation. So dialogue. But also inclusive because the convention has a strong focus on accessibility, okay? So measures related to prevention and protection, remedies, information, training need to be accessible for people with disabilities or for people who does not talk the main language. So really make to the extent possible, to make all the measure accessible for everyone, okay? Integrated. For those of you, who are familiar with labor and employment law, you can, guess that this broad personal scope, and also the broad notion of violence and harassment, and the broad notion of workplace, of world of work, might not always fit or be covered by labor and employment laws. Okay, that's why the convention calls not only for labor and employment laws to implement this convention, but also to equality, non-discrimination, to OSHA regulation, criminal law, migration law, collective agreements. So integrated in the sense that all different policies and laws dealing with the world of work, when they are drafted, when they are developed, when they are implemented, should have into their horizon also the goal to take violence and harassment into account. But integrated also refers to an holistic approach. And if you think about past decades of struggle against gender-based violence and harassment, or struggles against discrimination, I mean, we have focused a lot on remedial mechanism, redressal mechanism. What this convention said, okay, we need enforcement and remedies because we need to give justice. We need to give effective justice to all victims, okay? But if we focus only on redressal mechanism, we're not going to stop this phenomenon. We need prevention and protection. We need enforcement and remedies, and we need guidance, training, awareness raising. We need to change societal minds. Okay, so this is really an holistic approach, and all these three areas need to go hand in hand if we want to succeed. Gender responsive, not only because women are more exposed, okay, and we have definition of gender-based violence and harassment, but because the convention said clearly, we need to tackle the underpinning elements of violence and harassment. We need to address gender stereotypes, unequal gender power relations, because these are the root causes of many manifestations of violence and harassment in the world of work. So if we wanted to really eradicate it, we need to tackle the root causes. It's like being, having a fever and you just treat the symptoms, but you try not to understand and to cure what is causing this fever. You can get rid of the fever in a few days, but then after a week, if you haven't tackled the virus that is within your body, this will manifest again. Okay, so that is really one of the key principles of this convention, not focus on the manifestation, but try to understand the root causes and address them. Okay. Of course, this inclusive, integrated, gender responsive approach is very broad. Okay, that's why the convention said, wait, it's not only the responsibility of employers, it's not only responsibility of governments, it's not only responsibility of individual, it's a joint, it's a collective responsibilities. So everyone has a role to play within the varying nature and extent of their responsibility. So the governments has the responsibility within the nature, the duty within the nature of their responsibilities. Employers as well, within the nature of their own responsibilities. And workers and their association also have responsibility based on their particular duties, roles, and roles in the society and at the workplace. These are the three pillars. So you say it's like a temple. It's if we don't have the three, the temple will fall. So we really need to put forward measures that go and keep this, the three pillar building. Growing up to sustain world of work free from based on dignity and respect. Very quickly, I don't know how much time still I have. I will go quickly to the specific obligation for each of these pillars. Just to give it very quickly, but in the prevention and protection, we have the importance of defining and prohibiting in law. And this is not only valid for sexual harassment, for violence against women, for gender-based violence, but it's for all forms of violence and harassment. Think about physical violence, psychological violence and harassment, cyberbullying. All this behavior are embedded in the notion of violence and harassment. So we need definition and we need prohibition in law, because if the law does not prohibit, it's more difficult to change mindset, to change behavior. The convention mentioned in particular public authorities in the case of informal economy workers. And I know, I think it's the Philippines that the Safe Space Act, or one of the regulation, for example, help focus on informal economy worker and how they could also take up a complaint, and public authorities has the duty to help, if I remember correctly. The convention also call member states to identify groups, sector, occupation more at risk. Why? Because there is no one fits all solution. Okay, nurses in a hospital face different risks of violence and harassment compared to a clerk in a bank. A person working as a cleaning person through a platform company, it's exposed to different risk of violence and harassment compared to a waste picker. So we need these governments need to engage in consultation with workers and employers representative and identify those sectors, those group work arrangements that face violence and harassment, understand the specific risk, and take measures appropriately. So contextualize. Contextualize is a key word for this, for this convention. The convention also requires member states to adopt laws that requires employers to adopt workplace policy on violence and harassment, and to take into account violence and harassment and its associated psychosocial risk into OSHA risk assessment. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the psychosocial risk, but these are, for example, stress, organizational structure, clarity of roles. So are all these factors at the workplace organizational level that have an impact on the mental health, okay? So stress could be a factor leading to violence and harassment, leading to shouting to our co-workers, leading to shouting towards or be aggressive towards a third party, okay? So the convention calls, let's take this psychosocial risk related to violence and harassment into account, providing training and, of course, worker collaboration. Just very quickly, the recommendation highlights some of the elements for the workplace policy, okay? So we don't have time to go through it, but it's very detailed, and we should, of course, have a zero tolerance statement, and then both prevention and redressal mechanism. One important thing about the risk assessment is that recommendation in paragraph 8 explicitly recommend that risk assessment, so OSH, occupational safety and health measures, not only take into account the risk arising from the working condition and arrangement, so working alone, working in agriculture, working late at night, no, not only this factual, risk, not only third parties, okay, but also risk that arise from discrimination, abuse of power relations, gender, cultural, and social norms that support violence and harassment. This is really a game changer. And this is where you actually see how discrimination and occupational safety and health bridges, okay? So violence and harassment can be tackled through equality and non-discrimination laws, can be tackled through occupational safety and health at work, but it can also through the compenetration of the two, and in particular by including discrimination with the risk assessment. What does it mean in practice? And here you have examples, for example, I think Australia, New Zealand, Canada, some countries, I think also Singapore, but I might be mistaken. But other countries now are moving to include in the risk assessment factors that could lead to sexual harassment, for instance. So what is it? The lower diversity of the workforce. The fact that you have a workforce majority men, okay, this can be a risk, an hazard that could lead to violence and harassment. The fact that you walk, into the workplace and you hear this patriarchal, macho, masculine, racist culture, this could be another risk and hazard that can lead to sexual harassment, racial harassment, harassment towards people with different nationalities. Okay, so these factors now need to be included in the risk assessment. And what is the importance of this risk assessment? That and you know better than me, occupational safety and health need to be regularly rechecked, and measures need to be readapted to changing situation. So it allows discrimination to be, you know, to have a regular monitoring mechanism. The pillar on enforcement and remedies is all, again, very rich. So what is important here to highlight is that the convention calls for establishing or strengthening easy to access, effective and safe reporting and dispute resolution mechanism, both internal and external to the workplace. It also called for the protection of complainants, victims, whistleblowers, witnesses against any forms of retaliation or victimization. And we know that retaliation is, you know, one of the obstacles, because people, we do not talk. They are afraid to lose their contract. They are afraid to lose their job. They are afraid of their reputation, of, you know, to be further impacted. The convention calls, wait, member states, you need to put in place a legislation that protects against retaliation, because someone who has the courage to speak up, okay, needs to be protected. Then there is the right to remove themselves in case of imminent and serious danger. The role of labor inspectors and other authorities that deal with enforcing laws and policies related to violence and harassment is also highlighted, and sanction and counseling. The remedies are very, you know, just one paragraph of the recommendation. I mean, the remedies are very broad for the victims. So it could be the right to resign with compensation, restatement, compensation for damages, legal fees. Yeah, one of the interesting is that the recommendation also called for the victims of violence and harassment should have access to compensation in case of psychosocial, physical, or any other injuries or illness which result in incapacity to work. This is a new development, and we have some countries that have already moved in that direction. So listing in the occupational disease that, you know, give access to compensation for incapacity to work, to illnesses or injuries which are based or derived from violence and harassment. So you have Denmark, for instance, also have Canada, but also Republic of Korea amended so to include the occupational illness as also illness caused by work-related mental distress due to harassment in the workplace. So this is part of the protection that is given to the victim. And final, the last pillar is the guidance and training. And this is really not only, as I said, including violence and harassment in relevant policies, but also raise awareness, have gender-responsive curricula in education. I mean, the recommendation talk about all educational system, okay, at all levels, because we cannot pretend that when a worker enter the labor market, you know, he or she can be already trained or aware of this. I mean, this should start, since it's changing social mindset and cultural mindset, the education system should be involved since the early stage to have gender responsive, respectful curricula. So to really shape a new way of dealing, a new way of treating other people based on dignity and respect. And of course, being respectful of all differences and be inclusive. Then the recommendation also talk in particular about key actors in the world of work. So from labor inspectors, judges, so they should be trained and you know, empowered to be able to deal with violence and harassment, and the role of journalists and media personnel. And this is something that was quite, you know, was the African group that was quite vocal during the standard setting. The role of media in perpetuating discrimination, in perpetuating stereotypes, also in relation to episodes of violence and harassment. So it's in every country, you know, that journalists at times or media just blame the victim of sexual abuse, of rape, of sexual harassment. It's their fault. No, it should change. It's not their fault. It's the perpetrators and all person like them that should be more respectful. So the role of journalists and media personnel in changing this narrative is highlighted in the recommendation. And the ILO is supporting a few countries to work with journalists in making sure that, you know, we change this approach. And we have guidance for journalists on how to depict stories of violence and harassment. The final element, I mean, there are a lot of innovative elements of this convention, but for this session, I just pick up a few that could be of interest. The final element is that this convention recognizes the linkages between domestic violence and the world of work. We mentioned already domestic violence, intimate part of families, also in the previous presentation. In the past, domestic violence, and even nowadays, in some part of society, domestic violence is considered a family business, an internal business. I mean, it happens in the house, it stays in the house, okay? However, does it really stays in the house? It doesn't, okay? Because if you think of the effect for the victims of violence and of domestic violence, can they be fully productive at work? No. Do they might need time to go to court or to go to social workers? Do they need time to protect their children, to find a new place? So domestic violence reverberates far beyond the walls of the house. And for the victim is something that she or he carries also to work, okay? But also domestic violence can also be a risk for other co-workers, okay? There was news in some countries of, you know, perpetrators of domestic violence following the victim at work and creating a risk for other co-workers, waiting for her in the parking lot or entering the supermarket or entering workplaces and, you know, being aggressive. This also creates a risk for other co-workers. So domestic violence also become an occupational hazard, not only for the victim, but also for other co-workers. So this convention, for the first time ever, okay, recognized that domestic violence does not stay in the home, but has an effect on the world of work. And the convention asks and calls member states to mitigate its impact so far as is reasonably practicable. What does it mean, mitigate its impact? Here we should read the recommendation that provides some examples of measures that can be put in place. And these are, for example, leave for victims. And there are many countries that nowadays foresees paid or unpaid leave for victims of domestic violence. Can be used for go to court. As I said, I mean, different needs that the victim could need to deal with. Flexible working arrangement, because as I said, in general, the workplace and your shift is the place where the perpetrator could find you as a victim. So allowing the victim to change her shift or change their shift, to change the working arrangement, to have some flexible working arrangement, so working from, remotely, or from a different duty station temporarily, which may be also convenient for the victim. All these are, measures that could somehow mitigate the effect for the victim and protect also other co-workers. Temporary protection against dismissal. Because, I think here we don't need research, but we have research. Victims of domestic violence are not 100% productive, could not be 100% productive. Including domestic violence in workplace risk assessment. And here, there are many countries that, for example, grant the employers the rights to get orders from the tribunal, from the court, against perpetrators of domestic violence. So they could not, for instance, get closer to the workplace. But also, what does it mean, also including domestic violence in the workplace risk assessment? That if an employer is aware that this situation are happening, I don't know, it could be having the pictures with the security, personnel to make sure that they know that these people cannot enter the workplace, putting cameras, VCT cameras in the parking slot, ensuring that there is enough light. So, there are preventive measures that could help mitigate this risk. And of course, awareness raising. Awareness raising also on the services that might be available in the community, in the public authorities nearby. So yeah, this could help also the victim. And then at the end of my presentation, these are some few ILO resources that might be useful for you, that now you start embarking on the exciting journey of implementing Convention 190. Ratification is a first step. We hope to receive the ratification instrument in Geneva very soon, because this is when the convention the ratification process will be finalized. So far, we have 36 ratification, which is a very high number, given that the convention is still a baby. It has 4 years and a half. And we have 2 years of COVID, when all parliaments were just busy with other, and rightly so, priorities. So this is really just a testimony of the importance of this convention, of the importance of this topic, and how we should all do our part to make this convention a reality. I hope that it was clear, but I'm available for any question. Over to Francisca.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ms. Bigini, for discussing what constitutes violence and harassment in the world of work by giving us the overview and scope of ILO Convention 190. I think it's a great timing that ILO Convention 190 has just been ratified in the Senate just before this webinar. Okay, so so as discussed by Ms. Bigini, it is this part of the discussion is the prevalence and the frequency of violence and harassment, wherein we learned that more than 3 out of 5 victims has experienced violence and harassment at work multiple times. And while women are already at risk, the frequency is even more so with migrant women, which just shows that discrimination has relation with risk of violence and harassment. Thank you again, Ms. Bigini, for such elaborate presentation of Convention 190. So now, we are now opening the floor for your questions and comments. I think we have questions from our Zoom. Yes.
Yes, I think I have a few questions here. But first, no, with the Philippines ratification of Convention 190, need to amend previous laws regarding violence and sexual harassment. As previously discussed with Ms. Choice, the legal framework of the Philippines when it comes to violence and harassment and sexual harassment is very extensive. There have been laws that were already passed, and the very recent was the Safe Spaces Act. But with the ratification, does the country need to amend such law to comply with the requirement of the ratification? So that's the question from one of our participants. I think Valentina can answer this one.
Yeah, thanks. Now, of course, following ratification, a member state is required to put in place measures in law and practice that comply with the ratification, with the convention. So in the case that there might be some gaps in protection, or that some provision are not in line with the new treaty, of course, this will go through a revision process. This is, it's something that will come time by time. It's not that, first of all, there's no country. And, I've been following many countries in the last 4 years, and we're giving support in doing comparative analysis, gap analysis, and reforms of labor legislation. There is no country that the legal system is fully in line with the convention. But what I can say is that every country has some legislation, so which is positive. This could also be in criminal law. I mean, it's really positive. So the fact is how through social dialogue we embark in a process that of course amend or put forward new provision in the interest of victims of violence and harassment. So yeah, there will be, when you know that when you ratify a convention, the ILO supervisory mechanism enters into action. So Philippines will have to submit a first report on how the legal and policy framework align with the convention, and the committee of experts could provide some recommendation. Of course, this is a new convention. But as I said before, the Philippines has a strong legal framework. Perhaps not all of the provision could be there, but I mean, through equality, through all the provision that you have on gender-based violence and sexual harassment, occupational safety and health, and also sectoral provision, I think you are well placed to start and to go even better.
Thank you for that, Valentina. I guess we have a few more questions from the participants. Yeah.
Okay, I believe this question is for Miss Joyce Lamactod. So this is a question from Laudisha Casanya. She is a labor representative in CTITC FFW TF2 Kilos Damit Industrial Global Union. So to Ms. Lamactod, are the findings based only on reported cases to police or barangay? Well, the second question will be, how about those cases reported through trade unions or LMCs handled under the COD or through grievance process in the CBA or case filed in NLRC?
Thank you, Rosie. So to answer Ms. Laudisha's question, my data of police-reported sexual violence and harassment is from the PNP crime database. So if the complaint was lodged in the barangay, it is automatically forwarded to the Philippine National Police as a complaint. So it forms part of their databases. So it includes those that are received in the barangays. But for cases reported through trade unions, LMCs, or the CODI or the grievance process, or under the CBA and those filed in NLRC, if those cases have been elevated to the Philippine National Police, then it is included in my analysis. But for those that have been resolved or is still in process in those machineries, then it is not included in my analysis. I hope it answers your question.
Thank you, Ms. Joyce.
Yes. So, Ms. Joyce, we have a next question for you from Athena, our colleague in ILS. Can the methodology used in the study be explored in determining gender-based violence correlation to productivity itself? Is there a method applicable in measuring productivity trends in the workplace?
Okay, so Athena, to answer your question, there are studies that explore productivity in different countries, but you have to be very specific on the metrics and what you want to achieve when you say productivity. Does it mean productivity of the company, productivity of the worker? Because when you use the methodology that I applied in this research, you need to be very specific, and you have to make sure that the data is available if it is going to be a firm level analysis or if it's going to be an individual level analysis. So I hope it answers your question.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Joyce. So for this next question will be for Miss Valentina. This is also from Miss Athena of ILS. So the question is, due to lack of employer-employee relationships, workers in the informal economy may be more at risk of experiencing violence and harassment. Further, underreporting to authorities may be prevalent in the sector. What measures policy can address this to improve their productivity and improve their working conditions?
Well, this is thanks for the question. This is very pertinent, and we might need to organize another seminar, another webinar to talk about these, these issues. Well, I mean, the convention. Let's start from the convention. The convention highlights the role that public authorities could play in protecting and empowering informal economy workers. What does it mean? That in the informal economy, it happens, unfortunately, that public officials are the perpetrators of violence and harassment towards informal economy workers. Okay, and this has an impact on their productivity, but also their health. So a first measures could be how we train, sensitize public authorities to be more respectful and to refrain from any acts of violence and harassment towards informal economy workers. So this is a first policy measure that can be done. In some countries, informal economy workers are, even if they are out of the scope of the employment employment relationship, they might be granted some specific labor rights. So this again could be a way to ensure that they could access services, but they could also claim for their rights. Another I mean, seeing from what what's happening in some countries is also to ensure that they could access public services. So making sure that they are within the scope of the labor law to the extent possible. I mean, just an example, domestic workers. Domestic workers are mainly informal. They are not covered from the labor law. But one of the policy measures and legal measures that could be granted is to include these workers within the scope of the relevant legislation. Another policy option also to improve their productivity is also how you reach out through union, how you unionize the informal economy workers to make sure that collectively they can also, respond and put forward and be empowered and have their voice heard. But of course, the issues of informal economy is a broader one. And this goes back to one of the key principles of the convention that say, we cannot tackle violence and harassment against particular group if we don't tackle the decent work deficits. Okay, so how do we make sure that these informal economy workers not only enjoy the fundamental principle and right at work, which are human rights, okay, but also decent working condition. So a first step is continuing pushing for transition from informal to formal economy and to ensure decent working condition in line with recommendation 204 of the ILO on informal economy. I hope to have replied.
Thank you for that, Valentina. We have another question for you regarding the ratification of ILO Convention 190. So as recommended by Recommendation 206, can the Philippines go further and determine violence and harassment at work as a compensable injury?
Yeah, I was muted. So compensable injury, this is the question. Yeah. Okay, the convention The convention doesn't say anything about that. The convention only says that we need the government, the member states need to provide effective remedies, okay, to all victims. If you look at the recommendation and in the presentation that I can share with you later on, I made reference to the relevant section of the recommendation. So paragraph 15 suggests that victim of violence and harassment should have access to compensation in cases of psychosocial, physical, or any other injury or illness which result in incapacity of work. So, and what is the rationale behind? The rationale behind is that violence and harassment not only is a discrimination issue, but this is an occupational hazard. So the rationale here is why, okay, if a worker lose his or her capacity to work because of, you know, a malfunctioning of a machine, or because he falls from, you know, high. Okay, this, without any doubt, it will be covered by compensation as occupational injury, right? So if violence and harassment is an occupational hazard, and you lose your capacity to work because of violence and harassment, you know, these accidents need to have the same treatment. So if, for example, due to physical violence, you cannot work anymore, or you can work at a lesser extent, the recommendation says, yeah, you should access compensation in case of, in this case, okay? Because if you, this is one of the effects of bringing violence and harassment within the realm of occupational safety and health. And there are member states, there are countries that have already started doing it. So I was mentioning Canada, but you know, there are many countries now that are moving, Korea, some European countries as well. And it's, I mean, it falls logically from the fact that you have violence and harassment listed as an occupational hazard. I hope it is clear, the answer, and over back to one of you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, my apologies. Thank you for the for the answer, Ms. Valentina. So we will be entertaining one last question. This is for Ms. Joyce Lumactod. So the question here is, have you identified specific occupational or industry groups where cases of violence and harassment in the work environment are prevalent? This is from David Gopilan from Associated Labor Unions.
Okay, so thank you, Sir David, for that question. So I wanted to expound on my my data set. So my units of analysis are individuals. So I looked at the individual females, and in terms of the cases filed with the PNP, I looked at the perpetrator and the victim. So in terms of industry groups, it is not included in my data, but rather I could share that based on the geometric theory of crime, the incidents where sexual violence and harassment are prevalent from 2017 to 2022 are in the activity nodes as I explained earlier. It's either they're on their way to work, on their way home, and in places that are at work but outside, sometimes outside the office hours or in office gatherings. And the perpetrators are majority having no relation to the victim, but rather a colleague, an employer, or someone that they met within their regular walking or commuting environment. So yeah, to simply answer your question, it's not my units of analysis are individuals and not industry groups or occupational groups.
Thank you, Ms. Joyce. So this is a follow-up question from Mr. David. He stated that I also acknowledge that your thesis involved 2018 data. In case you'd be given more recent data, like 2021 or 2022 data, what findings can we expect if we would use the same methodology you deployed? Well, Sir David, I really have to do the estimations and the heterogeneity analysis and placebo test to answer your question. So for now, I cannot answer the 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 results for the recent data, but well, we'll see if we could have that, if we could have that. But for now, I cannot make an assumption with what I have, with future data that I will have. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Lumactud. So to our viewers and participants, we know that you have a lot of insights and questions, but we would like to apologize and that we must end our Q&A for the interest of time. Thank you for your understanding. I would give the virtual floor to my colleague, Ms. Chaska.
Sorry. Thank you, Rosie. And indeed, we have seen how violence and harassment affects not only women, but everyone in the workplace. So violence and harassment requires a systemic response in the workplace, which causes physical, psychological, psychosocial, and economic harm against a person on the basis of gender, which often falls upon uneven power dynamics between men and women, or managers and employees. So violence and harassment is also a serious human rights violation that diminishes gender equality and workplace safety. So although it affects all gender, we have seen that women experiences gender-based violence, harassment at a higher rate than men, and has far-reaching implications on the victim's personal and professional performance and success due to the possible impairment to mental and physical health, and even increased anxiety and stress. So the risk of exposure to violence is often greater in jobs, as mentioned, and sectors where the work is informal or there is more precarity, where the workers are prohibited from joining and forming trade unions as well, and where management accountability is very low. So gender-based violence and sexual harassment also contributes to the gender pay gap and affects women's opportunity for advancement and career progression. So before we end this session, maybe we can request our speakers, Ms. Bikini and Ms. Lumactud, for their last round of messages for the participants and viewers. So anyone who would like to start first?
I volunteer to start first. All right. So, well, ratification of ILO Convention 190, the institute has provided some legwork that that help us in identifying the gaps of existing laws. So we already started some of the legwork that comes with ratifying the conventions, the obligations of ratifying the conventions. But we are personally, I am excited to what this this process would entail, and hope that there would be newfound rigor and the motivation for ensuring a safe world of work would be more we would have more advocacies, we would have further orientations, and hopefully some assistance on how to guide
guide the Philippines in the entry into force of this convention. So yeah, I'm very excited, and at the same time hopeful that we would mitigate, you know, the violence and harassment, not only for women but also for the LGBT and children. It's for all. So we because like the presentations earlier, it really affects not only the economic choices, productivity. It affects the not just the victim. It affects the family, the society. So yeah, that's what I hope to to share.
We go next. Now, first of all, thanks for reaching out to the ILO, and again, congratulations for this important, first of all, for this important and very timely seminar, and for all the research and work that you have been doing. As I said, I will be very interested to receiving the research that was presented earlier. Congratulations to the country for the ratification. Please push for the ratification instrument, you know, to fly to Geneva as soon as possible, so we can list you in our you know, in our list of countries that have completed the ratification process. And yeah, and as you know, Joy-san was saying, I mean, it's really a rewarding process and journey that you have embarked upon, and it goes beyond what is, you know, what is fascinating. It's that it helps you understand much more the society where we live in. It helps us create a more respectful and peaceful, not only world of work, but society for everyone. And it's something that we cannot do by ourselves, but we need collaboration and collective action. So I think these three are just, you know, some of the key, you know, motivation that should lead all of us and should drive all of us to work together and make this world of work and society a better place, and a place free from violence and harassment for everyone, despite their sex, gender, role, skin color, whatever. So well done to all of you, and you know, glad to continue supporting all of you in this process.
Thank you, Ms. Valentina Bigini, Ms. Francesca Castillo, and Ms. Joyce Alamactud for the closing message for our webinar series. So now may we invite our OIC Executive Director, Attorney Mary Grace L. Rigoberto Dosio, for the awarding of digital certificates to our speakers. And I would also like to acknowledge and invite OIC DED, Mr. Frank, to also join us for the awarding of digital certificate. Okay. So this certificate of appreciation is given to Joyce Ann Estomactud, Institute for Labor Studies, for sharing knowledge and expertise as a resource speaker, in the webinar titled Violence and Harassment: How Does It Affect Productivity, held on 15th December 2023 via Zoom. Thank you. Thank you, Miss Joyce and Miss Attorney Grace. So for our next certificate of appreciation. So this certificate of appreciation is given to Valentina Bigini of the International Labor Organization for sharing knowledge and expertise as resource speaker in the webinar titled Violence and Harassment: How Does It Affect Productivity, held on 15th December 2023 via Once again, thank you for our speaker and to Attorney Grace and OIC DED Frank for awarding this digital certificates.
Okay, thank you, Rosie. I think Valentina has to leave the room, but before she leaves, can we have a quick photo op with her? Can Okay. Thank you so much again, Valentina, for accommodating our invitation and for staying with us this afternoon. And have a great day ahead to you at Geneva.
Thank you for the invitation and have a great weekend and hope to see you soon and to collaborate soon. Bye to everyone.
Thank you again. So thank you so much, OIC Executive Director, Attorney Grace. And thank you, Rosie, for co-moderating our discussion this afternoon. And again, thank you so much, everyone, and to all our speakers for this opportunity to learn from you. So at this point, we would like to invite our OIC Deputy Executive Director, Camilo Franco Cabusas, for his closing remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, Cheska. Okay, and again, a pleasant good afternoon to all. Today we discuss violence and harassment and how the different forms of violence and harassment, including the gender-based violence and harassment, can affect the productivity and economic choices of women. We also delved deeper on the importance of ILO Convention number 190 and how it can affect and how it can protect individuals and workers from all forms of violence and harassment in the world of work. Our resource speaker, Ms. Joyce Anlumakud of the Institute for Labor Studies, discussed how violence and harassment, particularly sexual violence and harassment, can affect women, economic productivity, and influence their decision to enter or leave the labor force. On the other hand, Ms. Valentina Vicchini, our ILO specialist from Geneva, shared the framework of the recently ratified ILO Convention number 190. This milestone of the Philippine government now imposes a duty on employers and persons of authority in the workplace to prevent, deter, or punish acts of violence and harassment in the workplace. This duty entails creating mechanism in the workplace to investigate and address complaints and disseminating a code of conduct of workplace policy. This webinar today enlightened us about the effects of violence and harassment on women and economy and how ratifying these ILO C-190 advocates and institutionalizes gender equality across workplace, cultures, policies, and practices, and emphasizes that every workplace conversation, policy, and action have the potential to reinforce gender equality. The workplace is an important environment to address violence and harassment since it is one of the most important and widespread obstacles to women's economic empowerment. I'm glad that we are able to come together today in this endeavor as we continue to ensure the dignity and guarantee full respect for human rights in the world of work. Each and every one of us has a role to make our workplace free from violence and harassment. And we can also take a stand to empower others against violence, sexual harassment, to enforce gender equality. Everyone has a responsibility to respect the rights of other people. Everyone has a role to play in ending all forms of violence and harassment in the world of work. Before I end my message, I would like to congratulate the members of the Institute for Labor Studies Gender and Development Committee, as well as the Advocacy and Publication Division of the Institute for successfully spearheading this online event. Our warmest thanks to all the participants. We know that this week is a week of Christmas parties, bonuses, and shopping spree. So we thank you for actively listening and participating today. I also take this opportunity to promote our next webinar with the topic of menstrual leave. Kindly check our Facebook page, Institute for Labor Studies website for further announcement. We look forward to seeing all of you again. Again, muli magandang hapon at mabuhay and Merry Christmas to all of us.
Yes, thank you so much, Wise, Deputy Executive Director Frank. So at this point, we would like to invite everyone to share your thoughts on how we can further improve our webinars and online events through our online evaluation survey. As you can see, you can find the link in the comment section, or you can scan the QR code as posted on your screen. Also, as mentioned by Sir Frank, please stay tuned on our future events.
And that is it for today's webinar. I hope that everyone has enjoyed and learned so much from our speakers and from our discussion. Let us all look forward to more effective measures in protecting our workers from experiencing various forms of discrimination, violence, and harassment at work. Let us all call and take actions to make our workplace a safe and better place for everyone.
Okay, again, on behalf of the Institute for Labor Studies and the Department of Labor and Employment, we really do appreciate your interest in the timely and relevant discussion on violence and harassment in the world of work and how can it affect the workplace productivity. Again, magandang hapon and maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat.